So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ines Xenakis, but he's this brilliant, much like Henry, this brilliant polymath who was an architect, an engineer, and a composer. And this is about 37 seconds of chaos theory. So it's a gas expanding in a vacuum, and you should all look it up. It's a 11-minute movement. But this was how he calculated the notes of that. So when Axel and I talked about coming here and talking with you, I knew that I couldn't talk about previous work, and I wanted to be able to frame what we're doing both in school as well as in practice. And so I've been working on an essay, and I'll read a bit of that essay, which I hope it's a much longer series of 8 essays, but I hope to be able to share some of my thoughts through the work with that. So it is entitled Reframing Design in a Complex World. So operating within a more intricate and interconnected landscape than ever before, architecture is no longer confined to the creation of aesthetic pleasing objects or functional spaces. It has evolved into a practice that engages with a broad range of social, environmental, and technical systems. This complexity requires a rethinking of the architect's role, from a creator of static forms to an active mediator of dynamic processes. As we confront global challenges like climate change, urbanization, and importantly, social inequality, the demands on design have expanded, calling for a more critical and reflective approach. At the heart of this evolving discipline is the recognition that design does not exist in isolation. It is embedded in a web of systems, a network, if you will, that are constantly shifting, influenced by factors ranging from ecological pressures to cultural norms and technological advances. Designers must now navigate these systems with an understanding that their creations are not just objects or spaces, but active participants in a larger context. This shift from object-centric to system-centric thinking changes how we approach the fundamental components of design, form, beauty, and aesthetics. Form is no longer merely a physical shape of a design. It's an evolving entity that reflects both the processes from which it emerges and the cultural meanings it carries. Form must respond to its environment, adapting to the forces of change, while also acting as a powerful signifier capable of conveying history, identity, and ideology. This dual role of form is both process and symbol, requires designers to balance adaptability with intentionality, creating forms that are both dynamic and meaningful. Beauty, once tied to fixed ideals of proportion and harmony, is now seen through both emergent from complexity of systems and rooted in enduring aesthetic canons. While contemporary design is often celebrates the unpredictability of beauty shaped by interconnections within diverse contexts, certain aesthetic principles such as symmetry and balance continue to resonate across cultures and time. Designers must navigate this tension, creating work that embraces the complexity of the present while acknowledging the lasting influence of these aesthetic traditions. Aesthetics expanded beyond the visual to include the total experience of interacting with design. Aesthetics is not only about how something looks, but about how it performs, how it feels, and how it functions over time. This broader understanding of aesthetics as performance highlights the importance of well-functioning, efficient design. Society often finds beauty in the seamless integration of form and function, where the aesthetic experience is as much about practicality and efficiency as it is about experience. Importantly, art plays a crucial role in pushing the boundaries of design, acting as a critical intervention that challenges the conventional practices and provokes new ways of thinking. Through art, design engages with larger questions about human experience, power structures, and environment, forcing designers to reflect on the broad implications of their work. Art is not a mere add-on. It is an essential part of the design process and introduces moments of reflection and critique. And so, as design grapples with the issues of sustainability and social justice, It must address the civic and ecological responsibilities. Designers today are not tasked with creating beautiful and functional spaces, but also ensuring that their work contributes to the well-being of both people and the planet. This ethical dimension of design brings form, beauty, and aesthetics into direct dialogue with the processing challenges of our time, from climate change to urban inequality. Ultimately, the challenge of contemporary designers is to reconcile the processual nature of design, its embeddedness in dynamic systems, with the intentionality that gives design its symbolic and cultural power. This requires a nuanced understanding of the interplay between form, beauty, and aesthetics, as well as performance, and a commitment to engaging critically with the social and ecological systems that shape our world. By embracing both fluidity of design as a process and the deliberate choices that imbue it with meaning, designers can create work that is responsive, impactful, and enduring. And so that, is the beginning of a larger series of essays that I'm working on. And I hope to kind of walk you through some of the thoughts, however incoherent they might be. So I teach in the graduate science, or Master's of Science department at IIT. Henry was a former student, now a colleague, and works with me both in practice as well as school. And so I thought I would come here with a thesis to engage with you. And this thesis is around us as architects, rethinking how we would engage, how we should engage, and how we will engage, and how we must engage with our environment, our work, our clients, our cities, our world. And so I won't read this, I've done enough of that. But in order to do that, I'm going to use myself as a guinea pig. And so what is the role of the architect? I have a really strange set of titles. I've started a practice where we practice architecture in the traditional sense as well as in research. I'm one of 3 partners in a development firm where we build projects and large important projects, and also I teach. And so I don't understand how people see me. It's a very interesting set of criteria, and I often think maybe it's about the overlap of all of these different components. But one thing I do know is if I'm at IIT speaking to some professors, I'm a developer, so I'm the bad guy. I'm the anti-architect in a way. If I am in the development role, everyone else sees me as this eccentric academic who is trying to be a developer. And then as an architect, I'm the pain-in-the-ass client who is trying to convince or a pain-in-the-ass architect trying to convince a client to do something that they don't know that they need to do. And so I don't know that if it's really about this Venn diagram. It's maybe this idea of sliding scales of possibilities, as Henry was saying, this network of how I might slide between these various components or weighted edges to define any given moment where whatever problem we're looking at is seen through a different lens. But really, I don't know if I'm 3 people, but I see myself as one, and so the dual of all of these things require me to reframe myself in a new kind of practice, and I challenge you to do the same with yourself and how you practice architecture and how we think about architecture. So I will walk through a series of projects, but I think we're at this moment post-COVID, or and socially, are we on the edge of World War III or are we not? What's happening with migrant influx? There are many different kinds of large-scale issues that are actually affecting us, and so as Henry alluded to, Chicago here in Illinois, where we work and live and practice, has an area that's known as the Loop, and it's simply the Loop because all of the transit networks come in, they loop around, and they leave. And so it's a very old historic core that is, let's say, outmoded, outdated. And prior to the pandemic, there's what was the original sort of meatpacking district in Chicago was repurposed and converted into Fulton Market, the hip new fun neighborhood, right? And so everyone wanted to move there. We have Google moving there. We have all the tech. We have all the companies moving there. And this historic core, which was the center of banking, is now outmoded, outdated. The buildings are historic, so we can't tear them down, but they don't meet today's standards. And so we had to rethink that. But what's really interesting about that area is there is a moment at Clark and Lake, which is the single most connected component or place to the entire city through public transportation, as well as both airports in Chicago. That area was known as the Thompson Center, was a state building. So the public, the state government, we have federal government, state government, and local municipality. So the state built this as their sort of headquarters in the late 70s, early 80s, and it was designed by an architect, a famous architect, Helmut Jahn, in this postmodern kind of style, where he was interested in making sure that the power of government was accessible to those of us as citizens. And so it's a very classical form of a large public building with a rotunda in the middle, but he sliced half of that off so we could see into that rotunda. And so the state was trying to get rid of it because for many years it was direly underfunded, and it was costing the state way too much money. It would have been almost $500 million to renovate it and make it energy efficient and make it functional for them. And so they were trying to get rid of it for 20 years. A friend of our development group decided to respond to an RFP, which is a request to purchase this. And so he won, and when he won, we offered to partner with him to redevelop this with our client, Google. And part of what we said to Google was, you have a responsibility to Chicago and to society, and simply staying in Fulton Market is not enough. If you really want to say that you're a citizen of this community, you should help us revitalize this loop. And so we worked with them and convinced them to move their headquarters to this loop. And so we're actively under construction now and developing what will be their large headquarter, which is 1.3 million square feet. And so in this role, I am not drawing drawings, although I do draw drawings and give them to our architects. But it's this strange role of mediator between client, between society, between academics, between history, where it's important that Google understands that now that you own a civic building, it doesn't mean that it's yours. This building is deeply rooted in Chicago culture and what it means to be a Chicagoan. And so, the public concourse must remain public. And so how do you have a corporate headquarters with a public space is important. Many of the things that we looked at were completely reskinning the building and thinking about advanced solutions. So triple pane glass. There are several terraces, outdoor terraces, that now are super ecologically friendly. So they're greenhouses and kind of reusing those spaces over time. And taking what is a public plaza, every important protest that happens in Chicago happens at this plaza. And so now it's privately owned, and how do we think about still allowing for things like that to happen and making it a much more generous plaza was very important. So it was a very strange kind of role, or still is a very strange kind of role, but a very important kind of role in helping them define what the design criteria are, and what do we end up ultimately delivering to the public. And so a lot of what that entails is moving from an object to this idea of systems thinking that I'm very much interested in. And so we were invited by Rush, which is a large hospital complex in Chicago and in Illinois, to help them rethink one of their campuses. And What we focused on was this idea of the determinants of health, which are physical, individual, education, social, economic, income, status, support. And so we often think about a hospital as a place where you go and get stitches or an MRI or maybe a checkup. Medicine and health are far beyond that. There are many communities in Chicago where if you live, your life expectancy is 20 years less than other communities in Chicago. And so this death gap that we call it is something that's really important. And we wanted to focus on this idea of livability. And so how do we go from these abstract ideas of education or income to concrete things that we as architects can actually achieve? Because I can't solve education, and I cannot solve social and economic issues, but I can find ways to affect those things through maybe some strategies. And so this helped us look at Rush Oak Park, which is a community hospital in a smaller neighborhood that has been constantly added on to and rethought, but never thought of as a whole. And so we said, okay, we're going to look at this, but we're not going to look at the hospital, we're going to look at the community. And the client, who was he is a very forward-thinking gentleman, said, what if we could help children that don't have families with their well-being by also helping animals that are abandoned and discarded. And so if children could play with dogs, we could probably think about how we would help them to heal. And so this thinking was interesting, and I don't know that if he thought that would lead to something, because he was asking me for a new hospital. But so we analyzed the area, and we kind of looked at livability, and Henry and I are working on our own version of what this means, but really kind of taking stock of what's there. And what does it mean to be in a neighborhood? So what is the program makeup of a neighborhood that might allow us to live there in a healthy way? And then we asked this question, what if healthcare is a park or a home or multi-generational living? In US culture, we tend to take our grandparents and elderly and cart them off somewhere where they're out of our sight, because we don't like to deal with that problem. But the elderly and children interacting on a daily basis is really, really important for society, for the development and growth of those children. So what if it's multi-generational living? Can healthcare be a grocery store? Chicago has a huge issue with food deserts. And so if we're going to create a healthier place, a new hospital, nutrition is also important, right, to that. What if it's a pet shelter? So we asked all of these things, and we did many different iterations, but basically we told them you should tear down the building and you should build a park. And in that park, you'll have all of the things that you need, and you will create another environment where now health is a kind of central component. And through a series of steps, we were able to help them understand that this, although on first look might be very expensive, it's very, very doable. But more importantly, like, what might that look like? And so a very low hospital, very park-like setting, which also requires us to put the parking below grade. It asks us to put senior housing with medical offices so that seniors and doctors can have a better dialogue. It asks us to put in various forms of residential components that might actually be a part of the hospital, depending on what issues you have. But it also creates this center park where we can hold health-related events and markets and things. And again, it should look nothing like what we might think of a hospital as prior. In a lot of what we do, I think engaging with social systems is really important. And so as Henry was saying, there's a development group in Chicago that wants to develop they've been trying to develop a parcel of land for many, many years. It's along the river, it's very nice. but they just can't seem to get it. It's not economically viable is what it comes down to. If it were economically viable, it would have been developed many years ago. But we have this love of sports in the US, and so we build stadiums, and the Sox, which is we have 2 baseball teams, are in the South Side, and they've started in the South Side, and that is their home. Guaranteed Rate Field is what it's called. So they have a stadium that is maybe 30 years old. It's not old, it's just not new. But as Henry said, it's surrounded by parking lots and all of these kinds of things. And that contract is up in 2029. And so the owner of that team said, listen, Chicago and Illinois, if you don't give me $1 billion, I will move this team to another state. So that got us thinking. And then Related comes along with this site that they can't develop because it's economically unviable. Says, we'll build a stadium here, and let's team up and get public subsidy, $1 billion, to build an urban environment where we have, restaurants and hotels, and it's lively and active. And as Henry alluded to, we looked at the network analysis, and we realized that this is the worst possible spot for that to go. Even today at 5 p.m., it will be inundated with traffic. There's not enough public transportation. But their home site where they currently are is surrounded by parking lots. It has 4 different train lines. It's got a freeway. It's got massive amounts of parking. It's just off of all of these things, what we dubbed the transferium of parking. And without being asked, my partner Quentin and I took it upon ourselves to use our own money to say, hey, this is a stupid idea. Let's give us $1 billion, but let's build a community around an existing public good and fix this neighborhood in Bronzeville that has historically continued to be disinvested in. It's a poor black neighborhood that is constantly underinvested in. And so $1 billion investing in a new community there would go further than building simply a new stadium. And so my firm and Quentin spent a lot of time thinking about what this could be, because in the press, shiny new renderings of Related's stadium downtown got everybody saying, hey, that's pretty cool, that could be exciting. But with a bit of imagination, we were able to show how that could be exciting in an existing stadium that was renovated. And so it's still up for debate what's happening. They've now built a fake little field on their site, and they're continuing to attempt to do that. But I think it's important for us to be engaged with the city and to be engaged with society. And I have a lot of students in architecture school who have this view of the site and the city, and things happen to us, but we don't know that we don't have to let those things happen to us. We're active participants in the city, in politics, in civics, and so we are actively participating in that through our discipline and using our voice where we can. And so one of the things that's very, very interesting to me is this idea of public space, and the definition. It's very interesting in this city. Public space is private, actually. But it's also like that in the US, but we do have some public space. But public space, universally, I think, tends to actively be defined by your ability or your inability to engage with economic activity, i.e., sit at a bar or sit at a park and buy a beer or get a coffee. So it's this weird kind of economic thing that sort of defines public space. And so I'm always interested in public space. And so Chicago has a biennial, not as famous as the Venice Biennale, but we have a biennial. And this previous year, we were invited. I have to say, owning the Thompson Center probably made that a lot easier to think about what that could be. And so we moved our school from IIT to the Thompson Center and used that as a way to discuss public space and social issues. And with that, we, Henry and some others in the firm, designed this piece that we call the forum, which was meant to be a backdrop. It was meant to be a gathering place. It was meant to be a place to come and hold lectures. Because that public space of the Thompson Center, which was government-owned, is becoming private, it was an interesting moment where we could occupy that space and openly have a dialogue about what does it mean when a company like Google buys a public building and makes it private. And so it was this very interesting kind of process that got me into a lot of trouble. But through that, I think another part that we must navigate is this idea of technological advances, and it's not enough to just make something, but you've got to make something with meaning, and so we strive to make things with meaning, and so here's a... And so this piece was as much about trying to create a place to gather and to discuss as it was about exploring architecture, exploring technology. And what's interesting about it is it's not just surface, it's not just decoration. It's a grid shell, it's a dual grid shell like Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, where the two sides of this piece act together. And each of the nodes simultaneously operate in tension and compression. And we were uncertain. I mean, we had analyzed it and we had done all the math, but we weren't sure what was going to happen. And at the end of the day, there'll be more iterations of this where I think it's structural. Part of the interesting thing about the technology was the firm in New Jersey that manufactures that machine is a friend of mine who invented that technology and is still continuing to invent it. Through this process, we were able to work with him to redefine his work, his machine, in ways that he hadn't actually thought about previously, and to get it to do new things. So the kind of scary part of that was there were no drawings, there were only models, and so models in New Jersey created the large shells that you see, and then another model went to this website called Send Cut Send, which does exactly what it says. You send it something, it cuts it, and it sends it back, but there's no room for error. And so we sent all of those individual clamps to them without ever having tested them in reality, or knowing what would happen, and then paid them, I think $10,000. And we got a box, and it worked. So it was really interesting. And everything was put together for the first time on site from these different design models, which was both fun and nerve-wracking. And so this idea of processual thinking and the emergence of form. And so Henry talked a lot about graphs. A lot of the way that I think, and there's no coincidence to why we're teaching together and practicing architecture together, is this idea of graphs. And so I was having a conversation with Axel the other night about what I think about plans, right? Drawings, floor plans, sections, and to me they're a result of decisions. And I find it interesting that often we make the decisions through drawing, which is good. We need to do that. But there's this project that we're actively working on in Los Angeles, which is an existing historic building. I am acting as both client, developer, and architect on this. And my partners are saying, we need the floor plans. Give me the floor plans, give me the floor plans, give me the floor plans. And I'm approaching it from this idea of the program. And so we need to rethink many things in the US. And one of those is how we deal with retail and space. We have a lot of cities that are just empty. They really are. If we walk around, and I've been walking around Guatemala City, your retail is very active. There are centers of activity where people come together. We shop on Amazon and we don't go out, right? And so we have to think about ways of new retail, new experience, right? And so design is not just where does the store go, but what is the store? How does it work? What is that experience? And maybe I buy something. So we've been working on this for a year, but we're at the point now where we're working on these network diagrams about how certain things work, what is the experience, and it's something that you've all seen, but we just go back kind of to first principles, and so it's a very mundane, boring building with absolutely zero form, but we're working through a massive document of relationships, and through that, we've done things like rearrange our cores, rearrange the way that the hotel works with a private club and also a spa, how the retail works, and how I move through that space. And so I find this idea of form as an emergent kind of series of decisions a very powerful, a very interesting tool. And hopefully we'll see something that is not stuffing this into an existing box. And so this idea of the future, or this idea of where this goes, for me is very, very important. Now, putting all this together, I was on vacation maybe a few years ago back home in California, and my partner called me, my development partner called me and said, I need you to go to Texas and go to Dallas. There's something interesting happening there, and I said, there's nothing interesting happening in Texas. But he convinced me to go after my trip, and I met with a group there who were economic professors from the University of Texas at Dallas. And in many cities in the U.S., there's these series of things that happen over and over and over again. So these kinds of patterns exist, and that's why we have the Chicago studio at IIT, is we're looking at these issues. Many southern portions of cities are where the poor socioeconomic groups live, and in the 60s, as white moved out of cities and we built our massive highways into these cities and allowed people to move out and commute, they predominantly built these freeways through poor, disadvantaged neighborhoods, deliberately severing their cultural significance and their sense of community. And so that's happened in Chicago with where the Sox Stadium is, and our proposal fixes that with a deck park. In Dallas, they're actively building a deck park to knit this community back together. And so I was asked to come and look at all of the land that was around this deck park and think about what we could do to redevelop it. And when I got there, I was invited to tour the park as it's under construction and speak with the zoo. So the zoo is this huge swath of 111 acres, which is interesting. Texas is an interesting place. It's public land, but it's kind of this private, non-profit entity that manages the park, and that's predominantly for budgetary reasons. Showed me their plans to redevelop this area adjacent to the deck park, and knowing that the goal of the community was to revitalize the community, I looked at their plans and said, this is stupid, you're going to ruin it. They were building a 7-story parking structure right adjacent to the park. And we all know that that's asinine. And we said to them, I said, well, this is an opportunity for you as this zoo entity, and they're all really interesting people who really care about animals, can reframe what it means to be an urban zoo. Especially given issues around climate change and other ecological issues, the Anthropocene, as some like to coin it. What does it mean to be a zoo in the middle of a city? What does it mean to be a zoo in the middle of Dallas, Texas, and Houston, where this is the center of oil, right? One of the biggest pollutants to greenhouse gases in the world, really, right? And so I said we should rethink this as as a place where we invite all of these companies to come and help us think about a future that is better for all of the animals globally. And what that entailed was rethinking the way their zoo worked, rethinking what it meant to maybe live in a zoo, rethinking what it meant to experience a zoo, and then also adding things like offices in life science, a new kind of animal hospital, and all these things that they had in kind of disparate parts, but were contained in this idea of what a zoo is. And ultimately, that kind of became this big idea of rethinking their plan, rethinking the way you approach it, rethinking the activity for the park, putting their education systems on the park, walking through bridges, right? And bridges might actually be aviaries. They might be a series of butterfly exhibits. We might have cultural components there. And ultimately, this went really, really, really well. And we helped them kind of imagine what it could be like. One of the, then we got to asking questions about, well, what do the animals think about buildings? And it's, when they're built, they're fine, but when they're building them, it's not so fine, right? Because they just think of them as mountains. But we started to ask these questions about how close or how integrated can an urban environment and a zoo be, because that will be a thing. And I think it was an interesting way to kind of pull all of these ideas together and help them reimagine themselves. So thank you.